Hello and welcome back to the second and final part of my basic layers video tutorial. In the previous video we saw what layers are and how important they are to any workflow. In this video we'll see how to use layers themselves. I have an image open on screen at the moment called Shapes in RGB, which is the source file for the layers panel example I used in the previous video tutorial. So we have our background layer, which consists of a white fill. Then we have our three familiar shapes sitting on transparency, which of course allows us to see through the grid onto the layers below. If you're having problems getting on to the layers panel or accessing the layers panel, then you can come up here to the window menu and select it from the options. I'm not going to do that, however, because my panel is sitting right over here on the right hand side of my screen. Now at the moment the green circle layer is sitting at the top of the stack, allowing us to see the entire thing. If I want to move that to another position in the stack, I can go right ahead and drag it somewhere else, and when I move it I get these thick lines show up between layers to indicate that if I drop it now, that this is where the layer will stay. Notice that when I move below the background I no longer get an option to drop it, and that's because the background is locked into position by way of this little padlock icon here. So instead I'll drop the layer between the background and the square layer like so. Now the image looks different, and that's because the circle is now underneath both the cross and the square, meaning that we can now see all of the cross at the top of the stack. If I wanted to move the circle layer below the background, I'd have to convert the background layer into a regular layer first of all by double clicking on the layer and then clicking OK to accept the name. Now I can drag the circle layer beneath the layer 0, as it's now called. That was formerly our background layer, remember? But notice if I do it, completely disappears because layer 0 is blocking it out. It's just a white mat. So I'll go ahead and move the circle layer back above the layer 0 like so. Now say I want to make a new layer and place a filled circle into it. I'll start by activating the layer at the top of the stack, since when I create a new layer it will always be placed above the active one. Now to add a layer I'll come down to this little icon at the bottom of the layers panel, the one that looks a little like a page, and I'll give it a click. And as I said, that adds the new layer to the top of the panel. Now let's go ahead and name it. So I'll come up to the name of the layer and I'll double click it. Now I'll name it Filled Circle or something along those lines. You can name it anything you like at home. So we know what it is, that's why I'm naming it, so we can keep all of our layers organised. Once I've named it, once I've entered the text that I want to enter to give it that name, I'll hit the enter key on the keyboard to confirm. Now I want to select this area in the green circle, this area right in the middle here, so the centre of the circle, and I can do that by coming over to the tools panel and activating the magic wand tool. Now in order to select anything from a layer it needs to be active. So I'll come back down to the layers panel and click on it to activate it. And now I'll come over to the image and click in the center region of that particular layer. Alright, we've now got our selection. Now let's activate the fill layer by clicking back on that. Now let's set the color we want by coming over to these background foreground swatches and clicking on the foreground one to open up the color picker. And I'll go ahead and enter a hue value of 60 degrees and a saturation and brightness value of 100%. To confirm that, I'll click OK. Now to fill the selection with the foreground colour, I'll hold down the Alt key here on the PC or the Option key on the Mac, and then on both platforms I'll press the Delete button, and that goes ahead and fills the selection with the bright yellow we entered a few seconds ago. I'll hit Control or Command D to deselect the shape, and there we have it. Once we start adding layers to an image like this, we call it a composition, which indicates that we have more than one layer. If I decided now that I wanted this particular layer in a different location inside the composition, I could come up here to the top of the toolbox and select this tool right here, the Move tool. Now if you want more information on the Move tool, then I have a tutorial ready and waiting to enlighten you. Just check it out on the freephotoshop.com website. But in short, the move tool allows us to grab a layer and move it around. A couple of options up here in the options bar we'll need to be aware of first is, well, these two right here. I'm going to make sure that the auto option is selected so that the move tool is allowed to automatically activate whatever we click on. Just makes things easier and quicker. And I'll also make sure we're auto selecting the layer by choosing it from the drop down box. Now I'll come across to the image and drag the yellow fill to the top left hand side of the composition. If it's not snapping into position, then you can release that and then come up here to the view menu and make sure this option right here is selected, the snap option. We also get some other snapping options in this menu here if you want things to work differently. For now, I'll escape out of these menus and I'll make sure the yellow fill top left hand side of the composition. You'll also notice that the layer thumbnail, which are these little images on the layers themselves over here in the layers panel, should update to preview the change we just made. And if you're having problems viewing the layer thumbnails, then you can change the size of them, either by right clicking on an empty portion of the layers panel and selecting a different thumbnail size, or by clicking on the panel's wing menu just about here and then coming over to the panel options and selecting the size of the thumbnails here. I'm going to cancel out of that one because I'm pretty happy with the size of the thumbnails of the layers in this particular version of Photoshop, because the size of these layers aren't dependent on the image that we're editing. They're dependent on how you have those preferences set up in the layers options dialog box that I just showed you. Now, say I want to duplicate the fill layer and place it over to the bottom right hand side of the composition. Well, once again, that's very easy to do. I'll make sure the layer is active in the layers panel and then use the keyboard shortcut Ctrl J here on the PC or Command J on the Mac, and that creates an exact copy of the layer. I can now use the move tool to go ahead and grab it and position it at the lower right hand side of the composition, just like so. Alright, so we've created this new layer, put it into position. What if we don't want it there anymore? Well, there's two things we can do. We can either hide the layer from view or we can delete it completely. So first of all, hiding a layer is just a matter of turning the visibility off, and we can do that by clicking this little eye on the left hand side of the layer, and once we click, the layer disappears from view. To show the layer again, we just need to click the eyeball again and we have it back. Hiding a layer is always the first thought and the first route you should go, because you never want to go back and use those layers again. If you're sure you won't need to, then you can just go ahead and delete it. So to delete it, just make sure that the layer is active by clicking on it first and foremost, and then come down to this little trash can icon and give it a click. You'll get asked if you're sure you want to delete it, so hit yes if you're sure and the layer will be deleted. Another way to delete, and I'll show you this with the other yellow fill layer, is to simply drag the layer down to the trash can icon and release. This time we don't get any dialog boxes, we just delete straight away. Alright, I can't remember if I mentioned it before, but if you're looking to save your layered composition, then you'll need to do so as a PSD or a TIFF file. Other formats such as JPEG and PNG don't support Photoshop's layers. Like I said earlier, such a huge subject, I could very easily do a full-blown series on layers. There's so much to know, but I hope you found this basic introduction to layers helpful. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you back at freephotoshop.com.